It was the winter of her 32nd year when Nora Hale found herself assigned to room 413 at St. Jude Medical Center, a corner room on the fourth floor, quiet as a chapel and filled with late afternoon light. The man in the bed had been there for nearly 5 months. A nameplate by the door read Mr. M. Ellison, but no one called him that. To most of the staff, he was simply the silent man. Nora had heard whispers about him from the other nurses. Some said he was a financier, some said he had no family, others claimed he once owned entire blocks of New York real estate. What they all agreed on was that he hadn't spoken or moved since arriving after a massive stroke. His vitals were stable, but his world had receded far beneath the surface of consciousness. For all intents and purposes, he was a man adrift, unreachable. The first time Nora stepped into the room, her breath caught. Not from fear, Nora had seen plenty in her years on the floor. She held the hands of children taking final breaths and watched lovers say goodbye across oxygen tubes. What caught her in that room was the stillness. It wasn't medical silence, it was sacred, as though the air held some private sorrow, folded so deep it had forgotten its own shape. Mr. Ellison lay with his head slightly turned toward the window, white hair swept neatly back, skin pale and smooth, almost regal. His hands were folded over the light cotton blanket, fingers long and elegant. There was a faded scar on his left wrist. A heart monitor kept steady time, but the rhythm was gentle, like a clock ticking in a distant room. "Good afternoon, Mr. Ellison," Nora said, not expecting a response. She adjusted his IV, checked his vitals, and tidied the linens with quiet hands. When she was finished, she sat beside him in the armchair and just stayed. 5 minutes, then 10, silence like a blanket pulled over them both. Later in the break room, another nurse raised an eyebrow. "You stayed with him." Nora shrugged. It felt wrong to leave. And that became a rhythm. Room 413 became a pause in her day, a sanctuary. Between running labs and tending to wounds and comforting the dying, she'd stop in, sit, and speak softly. She told Mr. Ellison about her morning, her little apartment above the bakery, her sister's baby learning to walk. She read aloud from a worn copy of The Secret Garden she kept in her tote bag. She prayed. Not always aloud, but in her heart, a small, stubborn hope. She didn't think of it as heroism or grace. Nora had lost her mother when she was 10 and her father 2 years later. Her foster family had been kind but distant. She had learned early that sometimes all you could give someone was your presence. That kindness didn't need to be answered to matter. Still, on some evenings, when snow dusted the window ledges and twilight painted long shadows across the tile floor, she would whisper, "If you can hear me, come back. Just come back." And the man in the bed remained silent. 2 months passed, then 3. One March afternoon, Nora arrived to find a small arrangement of daffodils in a vase on the windowsill. She turned to the night nurse, startled. "Did someone bring those?" "Nope, they were already there when I started my shift." Nora studied the flowers, yellow, cheerful, impossibly bright in the clinical light. Someone somewhere had remembered him. It stirred something beneath her ribs, a small, aching curiosity. Who had this man been? Spring rolled gently in like an old friend returning. Patients came and went. Nora's days stretched long, her feet aching, but her visits to room 413 remained a kind of ritual. Once she brought in a tiny music player and played Chopin. Another time she left a folded paper crane on his bedside tray. She didn't know why, it just felt right. Then one night she dreamed of him. He was standing by the window, awake, alive, with eyes the color of stormy skies. He turned to her and said simply, "Thank you." She woke crying. It was silly, she told herself, just a dream. Still, that morning she prayed again. This time not for him to wake, but for peace, for whatever mysterious road he traveled inside himself. And still he slept. But she never stopped going. She never stopped speaking, reading, sitting, praying. And far inside, in the unreachable place, something began to stir. The wind shifted in late April. Not just outside, where cherry blossoms scattered across sidewalks and pigeons cooed from the eaves of the hospital, but within room 413. It began subtly. On a Thursday morning, Nora was humming absent-mindedly as she changed Mr. Ellison's bedding. She paused, frowning. His fingers had twitched just once, so small it could have been a reflex. She waited, heart held still in her chest. Nothing else happened. She reported it to Dr. Klein, but he only offered a tired smile. Could be muscle memory or random misfiring. His EEG been flat for months. Nora nodded, but something inside her held fast. The feeling had returned, like the moment just before rain when the air thickens and waits. The next week it happened again. His eyes moved beneath the lids, rapid and purposeful. Nora had just finished reading to him from a book of poetry she'd found at a thrift shop. The last line had been, "And still I rise." He'd stirred at that moment as if something in the cadence had reached him. That night she stayed long past her shift. The ward had quieted, most lights dimmed, and she remained in the chair beside his bed, her fingers resting lightly over his hand. "You don't have to wake up," she whispered, "but if you're somewhere in there, I just want you to know you're not forgotten." "For the first time," she sang. Her voice was soft, untrained, but full of memory, a lullaby her mother used to hum while brushing her hair. By the final verse, tears pricked her eyes. Mr. Ellison's hand twitched again. Then his fingers curled slowly, almost protectively around hers. "The nurses began to notice." "He responded to your voice again," said Jamie, one of the night nurses, setting down a clipboard. "I don't know what you're doing in there, but it's not nothing." Nora didn't respond, not because she didn't believe it, but because she did. She began to come even on her days off, slipping into room 413 with a thermos of chamomile tea and news stories to tell. She spoke of the elderly patient down the hall who refused to wear anything but red socks. She read him her niece's letters. She described the smell of spring rain on asphalt. Her voice became a thread, connecting the world outside to the quiet world within his room. And Mr. Ellison responded in his own way. Small shifts in breathing, occasional flickers beneath his eyelids, a tremor in the corner of his mouth when she laughed. One Saturday morning, something new happened. Nora was sitting beside him, sketching idly in her notebook when she felt a movement. She looked up. His lips had parted slightly, barely, just enough to break the line of his silence. She leaned forward, "Mr. Ellison." "Nothing." But that sliver of breath, a single breath, felt like a mountain moved. Weeks passed, progress was slow, but it was real. The neurology team began monitoring him more closely. There were debates, theories, cautious hopes, but to Nora none of it changed what mattered most: he was returning. One afternoon in May, she found herself speaking to him not as a nurse to a patient, but as one soul to another. "I don't know who you were before this," she said, brushing a strand of silver hair from his forehead, "but I believe you were kind." She smiled, "And I believe you're trying." The next morning, he opened his eyes. Not all the way, not for long, but they opened. The news spread like fire through the ward. Dr. Klein himself came running. "They were focused," he said later, almost dazed. Not just reflex, he saw her. But Nora already knew. That afternoon, when the others had left the room and the sun had turned golden against the blinds, she stepped close to the bed. "Hello again," she said softly. His eyes fluttered open just slightly, just enough. And she saw it, recognition. It was like watching dawn return to a long dark field. She reached for his hand, "Welcome back." And for the first time his lips moved, dry and cracked. Not a full word, but unmistakable. "Thank you." They kept his recovery quiet, at his request, once he was lucid enough to gesture. His speech was slow, fragmented. Days passed before he could say full sentences, weeks before he could sit unassisted. But every time Nora walked into the room, his gaze lit like a man who had remembered something precious. They learned each other not in rushes, but in stillness. His name was Matthew. Matthew Ellison. He had grown up in Boston, lost his wife young, and built an empire of silence. Wall Street, private equity, townhouses with sweeping views and art behind glass. He had given millions to causes he never visited. People knew his name, but not his voice. And now this woman with soft eyes and worn sneakers had sat beside him day after day, asking nothing but presence. He listened as she told him about her quiet life, her griefs, her laughter. She had prayed for him when no one else remembered he was still breathing. When he finally found the strength to speak again, he said this: "You gave me back to myself." Nora smiled through tears. "I only waited with you." "No," he said with more certainty than he'd shown in weeks. "You stayed." He reached for her hand and held it, trembling. "And no one ever has." Summer brought warmth to the hospital windows and a slow, patient rhythm to Matthew Ellison's recovery. The physiotherapy team wheeled him into sunlight when weather allowed, his shoulders draped in soft blankets, his hands still thin but no longer fragile. Muscles woke with complaint, coordination returning 1 inch at a time. Some days his speech lagged behind his thoughts, on others words came clear and unshaken. He never asked for television or business news, he never mentioned his former life unless prompted. He preferred silence with meaning, like the kind Nora had offered him for months. And she stayed. Even when he no longer needed her care, she came. Not every day her shifts had changed, and room 413 had since been reassigned. But once a week, she'd knock gently on the rehab wing door, her lunch in a paper sack and a folded crossword tucked under her arm. Sometimes she brought muffins, sometimes books. Once she brought a tiny potted plant, a sprig of rosemary that reminded her of her grandmother's garden. She placed it by the window in his new room without ceremony. "Helps with memory," she said, brushing her palms together. "Also smells like comfort." Matthew leaned closer, inhaled the sharp scent. "You are the first person who's ever brought me something that wasn't expensive." "I can't afford expensive," she said, half smiling. "I wasn't talking about money." They fell into conversation that way, small truths wrapped in humor, deep waters disguised as shallow. She learned he had no children, that he'd once come within weeks of marrying again, but work had taken him to Tokyo, and when he returned, she was gone. She learned he had bought homes in cities he never lived in, stocked with art he barely looked at. "I think I mistook solitude for safety," he said one afternoon, his fingers pressing slow creases into a paper napkin. "You live behind enough glass, you start to believe you're untouchable." "And now?" she asked gently. He turned toward her. "Now I know what a hand feels like after months of darkness." They sat in stillness after that, no nurse-patient boundaries, just two people trying to understand the strange gravity of presence. Word of his awakening had spread quietly beyond the hospital walls. Not to the press, he'd made sure of that, but to his attorneys, his long-dormant staff, a few stunned business partners. They came in waves, suit-clad and awkward, bringing papers and tablets and updates on holdings he barely remembered. He listened politely, signed what he had to, and then sent them away. Later, Nora found him sitting at the window, eyes distant. "You all right?" He didn't answer at first. "They keep asking me if I want to rejoin the board, take meetings, reinvest. They want the version of me they remember." "And what do you want?" He looked at her and the lines on his face softened. "I want to remember what mattered when I was lost. You made that matter." She sat beside him, her elbow brushing his. Maybe remembering is more powerful than starting over. His smile was faint but deep. "I've been thinking about legacy," he said quietly. She frowned. "You've got buildings with your name on them, don't you?" "That's not legacy, that's noise." He looked down at his hands, still recovering, the skin sun-flecked with age. "My legacy is that someone stayed with me when no one else would. That someone whispered hope when I didn't even know I was still listening." He met her eyes. "My legacy is you." He began to ask her about her life. Where she grew up, what books she loved as a child, the first time she stitched a wound, the last time she saw her father. Nora wasn't used to being seen with such attention. She stumbled sometimes, unsure of how much to give, but Matthew was patient. He didn't interrupt. He listened like someone thirsty for truth. And through that listening, they formed something no one else could define. It wasn't romantic in the way people imagined, not at first. It wasn't marked by dramatic declarations or trembling hands. It was in the way she remembered his tea order without asking. In the way he noticed when she wore her hair differently. In the long, quiet pauses that felt full instead of empty. One August afternoon, they sat by the rehab garden, the rosemary plant between them. He turned toward her with something fragile in his voice. "Nora, have you ever thought about what you'd do if you didn't have to work?" She blinked. "Honestly, I've never had the luxury to wonder." He nodded, absorbing that. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "of letting everything go, selling it all, but not for me." She looked at him, heart cautious. "Then for who?" He reached into the pocket of his cardigan and drew out a folded document. His hands trembled slightly as he handed it to her. She opened it. It was a letter not to her but about her, and at the bottom a number so large her vision blurred. $50 million. To be donated, the letter read, in the name of Nora Hale, to fund a long-term care initiative that rehumanizes patient treatment and supports underpaid nurses, beginning with a wing named Hale Center for Compassionate Recovery. She read the line again and again, her breath caught. "I'm Matthew, I don't understand." He placed his hand lightly over hers. "You prayed beside me when I was no one, you stayed, you gave without expecting. That changed everything." She tried to speak, but no words came. He looked down, voice low. "I know it won't undo what you've lost, but maybe it can become something that outlives both of us." She stared at him, silent. Then finally tears slipped from her eyes, not just from the gesture but from being seen so clearly, so generously, without demand. "I didn't do anything to deserve this," she whispered. "You did everything," he replied. The letter made its way through legal channels, tucked into crisp envelopes and signed in quiet rooms. But its heart had already been spoken, between two people sitting beside a rosemary plant, one of them carrying years of silence, the other carrying the ache of unseen labor. The news stayed private for a time. Matthew insisted. He wasn't interested in press releases or handshakes in front of cameras. He wanted the gift to grow like a tree planted in soft soil, quietly, patiently, rooted in care. The hospital administrators were stunned. Whispers filled the hallways. No one could quite fathom it, that the man in room 413, once silent and motionless, had not only awoken but had transformed his fortune into something living, something human. And that he had done it not for a hospital wing bearing his own name but for a nurse, one among dozens, who had simply stayed. Nora, for her part, didn't change overnight. She still tied her hair up in the same messy twist, still took night shifts when coverage was short, still rode the bus most mornings with her thermos balanced on her lap and a book tucked under her arm, but something inside her had quieted, softened. A lifelong strain she didn't know she'd been carrying had finally let go. Not because of the money. Because someone had seen her and chosen to honor her simply for being who she was. She and Matthew continued their visits, though now he had regained enough strength to meet her outside the hospital. They walked slowly through parks with canopies of green overhead. She brought him to her favorite bench near a community garden where volunteers had planted rows of tomatoes and basil in old paint buckets. He watched a child in rubber boots water the plants with a plastic cup. "This is how things should grow," he said, his voice more sure these days. Messy, local, loved. She looked at him, trying to imagine the man he'd been before. She couldn't, and in a way she didn't need to. The man beside her now was not an echo of a billionaire or a boardroom ghost. He was simply Matthew, curious, deliberate, kind. They spoke less of the donation and more about the work ahead. Matthew insisted that Nora be involved, not just in name but in vision. "I don't want this to become another sterile wing with polished plaques," he said. "I want joy in the corners, I want music, I want families to feel like they can breathe." So she helped design it. She suggested a nurse's library, a communal garden, a quiet room for grief. They planned respite beds for staff to nap between shifts. She recommended that patient gowns be made from softer fabric and that lighting be adjustable by the bed, details others might overlook, but not her. Not after years of watching how comfort had been carved out of corners when it should have been the foundation. He listened to every idea like it was scripture. And the more they worked together, the more they softened around each other, like clay warmed in careful hands. One evening in late September, Nora invited him to dinner. It wasn't a big thing, just her apartment, lit by strands of warm lights with the window cracked open and the smell of roasted squash in the air. She wore a loose sweater and bare feet. He brought a bottle of wine someone had given him years ago and had to Google how to open it. They ate at her little table, knees brushing, conversation winding between laughter and stillness. After dinner, she lit a candle and sat on the floor, legs tucked beneath her. "I never thought I'd know someone like you," she said, voice low. He smiled, settling into the armchair, the candlelight soft against his cheek. "I never thought I'd be someone like me," he answered. She tilted her head. "What do you mean?" "I spent most of my life convincing myself I didn't need connection. I was proud of that, efficient, alone. And then I woke up to your voice and I realized maybe grace isn't earned, maybe it's given." She looked away, unsure how to hold the weight of that. He stood, walked over slowly, and sat beside her on the floor. Their shoulders touched, neither moved. After a long silence, he said, "I'm not asking for anything. I know. I just want you to know that what you gave me, what you still give me, feels like the most honest love I've ever known." She turned to face him, her eyes wet. "It is love," she whispered. "Maybe not the kind people put in frames, but it's real. It's the kind that waits beside a silent man and doesn't ask for anything back." He reached for her hand. And this time she didn't hesitate. As the months passed, construction on the new Hale Center began. Walls rose, windows were installed, furniture ordered. But more than that, a new philosophy took root, one born not from policy but from compassion. Nora was invited to speak at meetings, to mentor young nurses, to help shape training modules that emphasized dignity and emotional presence. She became the heart behind the structure. And every now and then, when the dust was thick and the architects were bickering, she would step outside, take a breath, and call Matthew. He'd answer on the second ring always. "It's going to be beautiful," he told her once. "It already is," she replied. Not because of the glass or the funding, but because a nurse had prayed beside a man no one remembered, and because he remembered her forever. The grand opening of the Hale Center arrived on a wind-kissed morning in early spring. The sky stretched wide and blue above the hospital, the air fresh with a kind of quiet promise. A small crowd had gathered outside, nurses in fresh scrubs, former patients with walkers, community leaders, staff from every corner of the building. There were no banners, no flashing lights, just a sense of reverence. Matthew arrived early, walking slowly but steadily with a cane, Nora beside him in a deep green dress and low heels she only wore for ceremonies. She hadn't wanted the spotlight, but she hadn't shied from it either. This place bore her name not for glory but for truth, and the truth had to be witnessed. The plaque by the entrance was simple, brushed steel with black lettering. The Hale Center for Compassionate Recovery. In honor of Nora Hale, whose quiet care rekindled a life, and whose belief in presence restored a soul. Nora stared at it longer than she meant to. Matthew placed a hand on her back, a silent gesture that spoke what words never could. Inside, the walls gleamed softly, painted in warm tones. Art lined the corridors, not stock photos but local work donated by the hands of people who had once been patients. Windows let light flood into every room. There were no harsh fluorescents, no cold silences. Music played faintly in the common areas. The nurses' lounge had proper chairs and real coffee. One hallway smelled faintly of lemon balm. Someone had left sprigs in a vase at the welcome desk. In every corner, Nora saw pieces of the future she and Matthew had dared to imagine. As people filtered in and out, offering handshakes and quiet praise, she caught glimpses of stories beginning again. An elderly woman laughing softly as she read aloud to her husband, a child handing a nurse a handmade card, a young man in a wheelchair tapping along to the faint rhythm of piano music. Life was unfolding here, not just surviving. Matthew leaned against the doorframe, watching it all with quiet satisfaction. "You built this," he murmured to her. She shook her head, smiling. "We did." They stayed long after the crowd had gone. At dusk, Nora wandered out to the healing garden behind the center, a small square with benches, wind chimes, and the rosemary plant they'd moved from his hospital room. It had grown full and thick, roots deep in its new soil. Matthew joined her there. "Do you think," he asked, "that it was fate, you being assigned to my room?" She thought for a moment. "I don't know," she said, "but I think sometimes grace sneaks in through the back door, not loud, not planned, just found." He nodded, gazing at her with something soft and unwavering. "I wish I had more time," he said quietly. Nora turned to him, surprised. "You do, you're healthy, you've come back from." "I don't mean years," he interrupted gently. "I mean time before, time to live like this, a life where presence mattered more than power I missed so much." She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "You didn't miss this," her voice trembled but held. "You found it." They sat that way, hand in hand, until the stars began to gather. Months passed, then a year. Matthew remained deeply involved with the Hale Center, though he stepped back from public view. He funded nurse training scholarships, launched a writing grant for caregivers, and quietly supported hospice programs across the country. And still, every Tuesday afternoon without fail, he and Nora walked the garden paths together. They never named what they were. Love lived between them like sunlight through leaves, shifting, steady, without need for definition. Sometimes he would brush her shoulder with the back of his hand, and she would lean into him with a small sigh. Other times they would simply sit in shared quiet, letting the world settle around them. He wrote her a letter once on plain stationery. It said, "You brought me back to the shore. I didn't know I'd been drowning until your voice became the air. Whatever time I have left, it's yours if you want it." She kept the letter in a wooden box beneath her bed, beside the only photo she had left of her parents. On days when the grief of the world threatened to rise too high, she'd read it again and remember what one quiet act of kindness had become. Years later, when Matthew passed peacefully in his sleep at home, the world learned who he had become. His obituary was short and understated, just as he had asked, but it mentioned the Hale Center and the donation in her name that had changed thousands of lives. And for days after, letters poured in from nurses and patients and children who had walked those quiet, healing halls. They spoke of soft lighting, of laughter in places once reserved for grief, of nurses who sat beside them instead of rushing past, of hope that came not through miracle but through steady human care. And always, somewhere in each letter, there was a version of the same sentence. A nurse stayed, and because of her, someone found their way back. Nora never remarried, she never needed to. Her life became full, not loud, but full with friendships, mentorship, and quiet moments with those she loved. She continued to work part-time, tending to patients who reminded her of Matthew in small, fleeting ways. Sometimes she would visit the rosemary plant in the garden and run her fingers across its leaves. The scent always brought her back to those early days, the silence, the prayers whispered into the unknown. And every time she smiled, because she had learned that some stories begin when everything seems lost. That love isn't always loud, and kindness isn't always noticed. But sometimes one act of faith becomes a legacy. Sometimes a nurse stays beside a silent man. And the world changes.